What we're going to talk about today, like we mentioned a second ago, is Social Security. And no, that doesn't work. You push it further this way. That's okay. Chapter 9 from the textbook on Social Security. And so what I'd like to do is cover 3 different aspects of Social Security. First, talk about Social Security benefits. And then talk about Social Security taxes. And then finally, Social Security reform. The main idea is that it is impossible to talk about anything dealing with the U.S. government budget, right? And that's a huge topic usually for any kind of politician looking at national office. What's going on with the budget without talking about Social Security? Because it's a huge chunk of the budget, as we'll talk about in more detail in just a second, and therefore, every serious politician that you're looking at this year at the national level, whether that's a state, U.S. senator from the state. Actually, we don't have any senators up for election this year, but your local congressman, if you have a senator back home, if you're not from Mississippi, all of these people should be talking about Social Security at some level because it's a huge issue. It may not be a huge issue tomorrow, but at some point it's going to be, and so it's important. If you're trying to weigh like which presidential candidate you prefer, definitely look at their Social Security plans because they do differ pretty significantly from one to the next. But we can talk a little bit about the politics of some of the different reform efforts as well. But first, let's just talk about kind of the magnitude of Social Security. Well, let's take a step back. First, let's talk about the broader question, which is, what is social insurance? That's a term that Social Security very generally fits underneath. And social insurance is just public insurance that is provided all eligible individuals. So the idea is that it doesn't have to be something that someone goes out and seeks and purchases in the marketplace. Instead, it's provided through the government. One example of this is social insurance. Another example of this is, one example of this is Social Security. Another example might be something like workers' comp. Workers' comp is a form of social insurance in that it's a public program that in case something happens to you and you're injured while working on the job, then you end up getting some sort of benefits based upon this social insurance scheme. Now, the biggest one that we have, obviously, is Social Security. However, I'm going to refer to the technical term for the program, which is OASDI. And when you think about what does Social Security actually do, thinking about its proper name can help you understand the full range of beneficiaries for this program. So it's old age, survivors, and disability insurance. Now, generally, we were just referred to the OASI as Social Security, and then we refer to DI as disability. And we separate out those 2 different programs often when talking about the political and economic aspects of them. So, for example, and what this basically does is it provides cash benefits to the recipients. So, who receives this cash? Old people do. People that survive those old people. So, what do we mean by survivor? Who's a survivor?
the spouse.
The spouse or the children can be as well. So, for example, actually, I got Social Security when I was a teenager because my father died, and I got his Social Security until I turned 18. So I was a survivor. As a minor, I was a legal survivor of someone who had Social Security benefits. My father wasn't that old, but you basically pay into the trust fund so your survivors can get that. And so I actually got the S part of the OASDI when I was like 17 years old. Anyone who fits the eligibility criteria can get it. Now, generally, we think about it as the old people, right? The old people can get it, and they can start at the age of 62, but there's different, you get different benefit amounts depending upon when you actually start taking Social Security. Now, it's not, in today's like modern, complicated family arrangements, it's not really clear who counts as a survivor. So, for example, again, just some more personal, random personal history. So, my mom's been married 4 times. She was married to my father. She was married to her second husband, who she's now remarried again. And in between, she was married to a third husband. Okay, whose Social Security could she be eligible for if third husband died, if fourth husband died? That sort of stuff. Could the first wife of her third husband get the? Who knows, right? That's why Social Security lawyers exist, and that's why those people go on infomercials and say, if you think you have a Social Security claim, let us know. It's not really clear who gets what at any point in time. However, pretty clearly, if you pay into Social Security, then you retire at age 67, then you get those benefits. In terms of survivors, it's a lot trickier. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how big this program is then. So again, we'll break this down a little bit between the 2 main aspects of Social Security and disability. And so if we look at the total outlays, we look at the entire program, OASDI, in fiscal year 2015. All right. The total outlays, which is the way the government talks about spending money, as they refer to it as outlays, was $883 billion. Is that a big number or a small number?
Big.
It's a big number, right? So anytime we're talking about billions, when we're talking about the U.S., generally we're talking about big-ish numbers. If we're talking about hundreds of billions, we're definitely talking about big numbers. Millions, even though $1 million sounds a lot to you and me, when we're talking about the entire government, the entire U.S. economy, millions aren't very big. It'd be a lot of money to us. It'd be a lot to Kanye, right? But it wouldn't be a lot to the federal government if you're talking about $10 million. $800 billion, though, it's a big number. Specifically, 4.9% of GDP. So that's how big it is compared to the entire pie of the entire U.S. economy is about 5%, or 24.1% of the federal budget. The single largest item in the federal budget is Social Security. It's big. Takes up a quarter of the total budget, $880 billion. If we want to break this down into Social Security, is $738 billion, and DI, again, this is the OASI, and then the DI is about $145 billion. Comparatively, disability is a lot smaller. Now, have you guys heard about these, growth in these 2 programs over the last few years? So which one seems like it's been growing more quickly lately?
Disability.
Disability. You hear a lot about the growth of disability, especially since the 2008 recession, right?
I watched a YouTube video where if you apply for disability and you get denied, and then you get an attorney, then it goes to this judge, but the judge is an appointed person, and they're told to just approve everything that comes through with an attorney. So if you get denied and then you hire an attorney, you get automatically approved for at least 3 months. Or 6 months. You get automatically approved for a set amount of time till they review your case again. I
Yeah.
thought it was crazy. Like, you may not be disabled at all, and you can be on it.
And you know, a lot of people when they talk about waste, fraud, and abuse at the kind of federal level, people often point towards DI, right? Because there are a whole lot of reasons why you could be disabled, right? There's a whole large categories of things that people say, oh, well, that could be you know a reason to collect disability why you couldn't work. I mean, one of the things that's fairly controversial is like certain drug addictions like count as a disability. And then people are like, well, that's their choice. That wasn't like they were born without a leg or, you know, whatever it is. And so there's a lot of complicated stuff. Again, you know, I'm not, you know, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this, but it did grow pretty substantially, especially after the 2008 recession. And people said, oh, it was just a way for them to get some benefits when they weren't really working, weren't really willing to work. Now, what's interesting is that although this number has grown recently, its growth actually is projected to be much slower over the next 10, 15, 20 years than this. All right. Now, we'll talk a little bit about growth rates, but this has grown a lot, but it's not expected to grow much more very rapidly for a while, at least not based upon current projections. In terms of numbers of people, in about a year ago, I don't have the most recent numbers, but January 2015, we had on OASI, again, that's what we refer to as Social Security, we had 48 million people. On DI, we had about 8 million. And so, do the math here, it seems like it's a little bit more generous on the DI side of things too. And of these 48 million, 41 million were elderly. And then 7 million not. So, again, OASI, right, Social Security, we think of it as primarily for old people, not necessarily everyone, right? Some are survivors, some of them get for other reasons. But 41 million of the people on Social Security right now are, in fact, the elderly. The average benefit is $12.62 per month. These are paid out on a monthly basis. All right. Is that a lot of money or not a lot of money? $1,200?
Well, it's a minimum wage income.
Yeah, I mean, it's enough to survive, right? I mean, basically an elderly person, when you combine it with Medicare, when you combine it with, you know, other programs that they could potentially get, you know, you think most old people, not most old people, but it's more likely that an old person owns their house outright and doesn't have to pay rent. All those sorts of things, that's enough to survive. Is it something that you should look forward to surviving on? No. You should hope to supplement this with your own individual retirement. Like, it's not, you're not going to be going to the Bahamas very often as an old person on $12.62 a month.
Reagan took Social Security, didn't he? Like,
Did he
took
end
his
up?
benefits.
He might have taken his benefits, yeah. I don't know. That's probably just, you know, one of those factoids that people have that I'm not sure about.
Well, it's just stuck in my head because I watched Trumbo, watched him like give a speech against communists, and then took the reinvention of wealth benefits.
Right. So how do these benefits come about? So people get a monthly check, and it's based upon their earnings while they're working. So if you don't work, you don't get Social Security. So it's based upon what you pay in. And we'll talk a little bit about how the taxes work later on. So it's based upon what you pay in for taxes, and you can collect it at a specific age. Generally, if you're born before 1955, you can collect at 66. And after 1960 or later, we collected 67. These ages here are referred to as full retirement age. Or FRA. Now you can collect some of your benefits in terms of your old age pension before you turn those ages. So, so 1955. So everyone that's retired now, who is just now retiring, is going to be somewhere. Those numbers don't seem quite right, but it's about 60. It's about 66, 67 right now. So everyone who's in this room is definitely going to be 67 or older, according to this, right? That's when they're going to be able to start drawing upon this. So the key thing to think about in terms of like why is this a big deal is that between now, well, I'll just ask this question. So why is this a big deal? Like, first of all, it's 25% of our federal budget, and what's happening in terms of the number of people on Social Security?
It's going up.
It's going up pretty dramatically, right? So in between 2015 and 2025, we're going to increase the beneficiaries by 3% per year. So the number of people hitting retirement age is going to increase by 3% a year. Plus, the average benefit is going to increase by 3% a year. So the cost is going to increase by 6% per year over this 10, 11 year period. 6% a year, you do that for 12 years, you've doubled the cost of a program. Right? So if it cost $880 billion in 2015, then by 2027, that's going to be costing $1.7 trillion. Pretty substantial increase. You guys know the rule of 72? So take, anytime that you have a percent change, divide that number into 72, and that tells you how frequently something doubles. So if you increase the rate of growth 6% a year for 12 years, then you'll double the amount. Right? So that's pretty dramatic. In 12 years, it's going to cost $1.7 trillion. That's a worry, right? Because what do we know? Well, we know that the government, that other things are costing more. What's one of the programs that's costing more and more every year in addition to Social Security?
The Affordable Care Act.
Affordable Care Act with Obamacare, as well as Medicare Part D and other parts of Medicare. If we have more and more old people retiring, they're also going to be getting Medicare. Healthcare expenses are increasing. That's going to cost more to the federal government as well. All of these things means that either taxes are going to have to increase, or what's going to have to happen is that we're going to have to give up other things that the government does. Fewer roads, bridges, smaller federal government in some other way, less defense spending. Something's going to have to give one way or another if we're going to be able to accommodate this. The way that we dealt with this in the 1980s is that we changed some of these formulas and we created what was known as the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, to get into that, let's talk a little bit about the way this is paid. So Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system. So current taxpayers pay for current beneficiaries. In terms of where do the dollars actually come from. So if you have grandparents that are on Social Security and they come into town and they say, oh, well, I heard, Nicholas, you got a new job, so you should be taking us out to dinner. And you're saying, well, actually, I paid for your Social Security check with my check, and therefore you should be paying me because that's where that money actually comes from. It's not like your own retirement where you'd actually save some money every month and it's sitting there in an account waiting for you to draw it out. Instead, what it is that the current beneficiaries are being paid by current taxpayers. So I get money taken out of my check every month. If you guys are working, you do as well. That's going to then pay for my mother's and my mother-in-law's and my father-in-law's, their Social Security check. That's how that money gets transferred.
Income tax, right?
It's actually through a payroll tax. So this is the FICA. We'll talk about this in just a second. But like if you look at that line on your paycheck where it says FICA, that's where it comes out.
So it hopes the labor force is greater than, your Social Security net, right?
Well, at the time it made great sense, right? Because you start a program, and when you start a program, you want to start giving people the benefits of the program right away. But you haven't built up any cash in the system because guess what? It hadn't existed before. So immediately, how do you start off a system where you're saying, okay, we want to help out old people and we want to help them out right now? Well, the only way to do so is to tax the current taxpayers and give it to the old people, unless we want to wait for like 20 years to start paying out benefits. And at the time that it started, the number of workers that were receiving benefits to the number of workers that were out there was like 15, 20 to 1. Right? Now it's getting close to 2 to 1. So the relative impact of Social Security taxes, like the relative payment for each individual compared to how much is getting paid out is much higher, right? So we're paying a lot more in compared to what people were doing 50 years ago. Social Security started in 1935. Not everyone was eligible until the 1960s. Basically, that's when it expanded to where just about every worker pays for Social Security. Some people don't, by the way. Right.
I wonder how you get out of that.
Very few people, but it usually, the only cases I know are certain state teacher pension plans. So they made the argument to the Social Security Administration that say, look, we have a system that's basically just as safe as Social Security. So if they pay into our system of defined benefits, then they shouldn't have to pay into Social Security. And so my mom, when she was at one of her jobs in Texas, she was a teacher for a while, and she chose not to pay into Social Security and only pay into the state retirement system. People can pay both, and basically you affect your eligibility for Social Security later on if you don't pay all the years that you're supposed to be, like that you could be potentially. So in Mississippi, you don't have that option as a teacher. You have to pay into Social Security as well. They haven't negotiated that separate deal. So this is different than a fully funded system, which is one of the reforms that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is part of the problem. So we have this growth rate, 6% a year, but also cost increase. Because of cost of living adjustment. Now, what I was talking about before is that 3% every year the benefits were increasing, but that's not because of cost of living adjustments. That was just because my average earnings are going to be higher than someone who's retiring this year because I'm living in a world where there's already been higher wages, right? So when I retire, I'm going to have a higher Social Security check. I'm going to have a bigger Social Security check than my mom's, even if we work the same job, because a teacher 30 years ago doesn't pay what a teacher today pays, right? But in addition to that, once you retire, you get an additional amount every year to take care of inflation. In 2015, the cost of living adjustment was 1.7%. In 2016, though, it was actually 0%. Because we basically had flat inflation. We didn't have enough inflation for them to justify changing the formula and changing how much everybody's going to get. So inflation rates were basically so low that they didn't get a COLA increase this last year. Let me give you some information about how early retirement affects this. So we talked about the full retirement age. It's about 67. if given that you retire at age 62, right? So 5 years before your full retirement age, benefits decrease by 30%. So if, based upon the formula, you were supposed to get a check of $1,000 a month, then you'd only be getting a check of $700 a month if you retired 5 years early. 63, it's 25%. 64, 20%. 65, 13.3%. And 66, 6.7%. Now, if you delay in your retirement up until 72, you can get additional amounts as well. Like you'll get a higher check if you don't start drawing on Social Security immediately. But what's one of the problems of this is that Medicare eligibility is often tied to Social Security retirement. So if you don't retire via Social Security and you've delayed that, and it sometimes affects your ability to apply for Medicare as well. Now, considering there are 2 different years, so for example, you can start drawing on Medicare at 65 and you don't draw on Social Security until 67, that like connection is somewhat loosened nowadays, but at the same time, they really don't like people waiting until they're 72 to start drawing on Social Security. It just kind of affects their books, and so they try to, the additional amount that they give you for retiring late doesn't really make it worthwhile, right? So you might as well start drawing on it right when you turn 67. All right. How does this work? Well, basically it takes the highest 35 years of earnings, does a replacement rate based upon the percentage of the final year that's kind of your highest earnings, and basically it's progressive in that if you earn more, you get a bigger check, but the additional increase isn't completely in lockstep, right? So if I earn 10% more than average, I don't get a 10% bigger check, right? Even though I'm adding in 10% more to Social Security than someone who earns exactly at the average wage. And if you earn 20% more, then you earn even less than on that second additional 10%. That make sense? Right. So the additional benefit of Social Security gets smaller the higher you earn, right? You get more money, but you don't get everything in lockstep based on a percentage basis. Now, where do the taxes come from? Well, taxes, like I said, come out of your paycheck directly, and specifically, this comes out of the FICA line. $7.65% paid by the employee, and 7.65% paid by the employer. So if I'm hiring Eric for the summer and paying him $1,000 a month, his check isn't going to be $1,000 because we're going to take off this tax and he's going to get a smaller amount. But in addition to the amount that I have to take out of his check and send to the government, I also have to reserve 7.65% out of my own pocket to be able to send that additional 7.65% to the government. So the total tax rate in terms of Social Security taxes is actually 15.3%, even though if you look at your check, you're not getting 15.3% less, you're only getting 7.65%. Now, economists would say, who ends up actually paying for the 7.65%? Who really pays for that? Yeah, you do, because I'm not going to offer you higher wages that if I were like in a competitive environment, if I had the money, I should be compensating my employees because that's based upon what they're earning for me. And so it's basically, if I'm having to hold this money aside, that's just more money I'm not going to give you as an employee, right? So even though it looks like you're only paying 7.65%, you're really paying close to the full 15%. This isn't the only part that's held back as payroll taxes, what else do you pay? What else is paid for by payroll taxes?
Well, if you spend your payroll, sales tax.
Medicare.
Medicare is also. So if you look at actually these line items, you pay 7.65% for Social Security. You pay an additional like I want to say it's like 1.6% for Medicare. So it's like 9.25%, right around there. So both of those get taken out in the same way. We pay for both Medicare and Social Security in the same way. Now, where's this money supposed to go? Well, we know that it actually goes directly to beneficiaries, but for a number of years, we were pulling more money in through these taxes than was actually going out to beneficiaries, right? So where did that money go, right? We might be bringing in like, $1 trillion in Social Security taxes, but we were only paying out $880 billion in benefits. So what happened to that other $120 billion?
Became a part of the general fund.
Well, technically, there's this separate part that's called the trust fund, right? So the Social Security Trust Fund was the excess taxes that they're supposed to set aside, right? But you're the federal government, and I don't know if you've ever tried to like trick yourself into having like separate budgets for different things, but there's this famous story of I think it was like Robert De Niro. At some point, a lot of actors at some point they struggle, right? Because acting it's very competitive. It's hard to get these gigs. Like at some point, they're eating ramen noodles. They're worse off than students. They're kind of begging, stealing, borrowing. And there's a story about Robert De Niro back in like the 1960s, and he called over some other, ended up being famous actor when they were both like doing this kind of like just barely getting by. And he had a series of jars kind of like up on his kitchen counter, and he had money in a couple of them. And Robert De Niro had asked this guy to come by because he's like, look, man, I need to borrow some money. And he's like, do you have money right there? He's like, no, that's my rent jar. I can't pay for lunch. I can't pay for food out of that other jar because that's the way I'm budgeting things. And if you've ever tried to do this, like it's hard to keep these things separate, right? Because you're always tempted, oh, well, I don't have any money for lunch, but I know if I'm trying to save some money to go on a vacation, I'll just take some money out of that, and then you have no money for vacation if you don't pay attention to this. So what they did is that they set aside this trust fund, right? This trust fund that had billions of dollars, like over $1 trillion in this trust fund at some point. But it's not going to sit there with cash because the government's running a budget deficit. So what do? The government, through their general funds, they're running a deficit. So where do they borrow the money from? Well, they say, can we borrow money from the trust fund? And someone in the federal government literally writes an IOU that says the general fund owes the trust fund a certain amount of money. So they borrow it from the trust fund. So the trust fund exists. This thing actually exists, but it's not a cash vault of money. It's a filing cabinet full of IOUs. So actually, in a bunker in West Virginia, there's a filing cabinet that has a bunch of IOUs, and that is the Social Security Trust Fund. So it exists, but where's the money going to have to come from eventually? Well, it's going to have to come from the general fund to pay back the trust fund for all this stuff, right? So if you look at the federal government's budget, you'll notice that they sometimes put these things on off, kind of like it's like on accounts versus off accounts budgeting, and it oftentimes has to do with this trust fund and how they balance this stuff out. All right, so all this money's in the trust fund. The trust fund is now, however, starting to run down. Like now we're paying out more in benefits than we're collecting in taxes. So we're starting to have to draw from that trust fund, which means that the general fund, the other taxes are going to have to pay for Social Security more and more so. So, real quick, let's think about this. 3 different kinds of taxes. You can think about taxes in terms of its distribution. And we can think about this in terms of equity. We can think about regressive taxes, proportional taxes, and progressive taxes. A regressive tax is that the poor pay a higher percentage of income than richer. So if someone says that is a regressive tax, the technical definition means that as you have a lower income, you pay a higher chunk in terms of percentage basis, not on a total basis, but on a percentage basis of your income than someone who's richer. So let's just take the example of someone who earns $10,000 versus someone who earns $100,000. Person who earns $10,000, if they pay $1,000 in taxes, their tax rate on average is 10%, right? So you earn $10,000, you pay $1,000 in taxes, that's 10%. Person who earns $100,000, if they paid a proportional tax, they would pay the same amount, they'd pay $10,000 in taxes, right? That'd be the example of proportional. A regressive one would be someone who earns $10,000 pays $1,000, but someone who earns $100,000 pays something less than 10. Let's say they only pay 5. So even though the richer person is paying more in taxes, they're paying $5,000 compared to $1,000, that tax would be regressive because the poor person is paying a higher percentage of his income in taxes than the richer person. Does that make sense?
Not really.
Okay. Okay. So I'll just erase this and then I'll put it back up here. So we'll have poor person 1. So I'm poor. Okay. And we have rich person over here. Okay, I'm rich. Income is 10,000. Taxes is 1,000. All right. So on a percentage basis, how much does the poor person pay? So 1 out of 10, 10%. All right. Rich person, very happy to be rich, has an income of $100,000. Taxes, though, are $5,000. Okay. So what is the tax rate? Tax rate is only going to be 5%. So they pay more overall in total taxes than this person over here, but as far as a proportion of their income, they pay less.
Oh, okay.
And so that's going to be a regressive tax. Now, let's keep these two people, and I'll just change these words up here. This will be easier this way. If we have a proportional, everyone pays the same rate. Okay? So we'll keep poor person over here. They earn $10,000, pay taxes of $1,000, their tax rate is 10%. So what would we need for the rich person then?
10,000.
Right. So now the taxes are equal to 10,000 in order to get to that 10% rate. Right. So this is a proportional tax, this setup, where each individual pays 10%. Now in kind of political parlance, what do people like to refer to this as?
Fair tax.
A flat tax or a fair tax is what you'll often hear, right? So at one point, when Steve Forbes was running for president back in, the dark ages, back in '96 or whatever, he was like, 15% flat tax, that's all we're going to do. And you can fill out your tax return on a postcard, write your income, multiply that by 15%. That's going to be your taxes then, and you send in a check, right? And that was going to be it. Unfortunately, based upon the way that our progressivity of taxes are right now, it would have to be like close to 23% for that thing to actually happen. And most people would go, wait, 23%? Well, most people that pay, earn $20,000 a year aren't used to paying $4,000 in taxes every year, right? So that'd be a huge chunk for them. But this is what a proportional tax system would look like. Now, progressive is what our income taxes actually are. Here, the richer pay a higher percentage of income in taxes. So regressive, the richer paid a smaller percentage. It could be more in terms of the total dollars, but it's going to be a smaller percentage. Progressive, they're actually going to pay a higher percentage. So if we keep the poor person here, income's 10,000, taxes are 1,000, 10% tax rate. And now we have the rich person, income 100,000. What might their taxes need to be then? If it's going to be progressive, now they might need to be paying 20,000 in taxes, which would be a 20% tax rate. So the key thing is that their tax rate is higher than the poor person, not just that their tax dollars are higher. That would be a progressive system.
Low income people here actually end up paying like a negative tax rate there, don't they? In a lot of situations, at least, like they get an income credit or something.
They can, but not overall on net because of payroll taxes and everything else. Based upon only their income taxes, you could see that, right? But income taxes aren't the only taxes we pay. That's the great thing about being an American, right? You pay all sorts of taxes, right? It's not just a VAT or, some sort of very straightforward tax. We have the most convoluted tax system you could possibly imagine. And it's for all sorts of good reasons, right? Like for equity reasons or to encourage certain kinds of behavior. We've talked about the mortgage interest deduction, everything else. But we have a very convoluted system. Now, here's the question, and this is the tricky part. Is the Social Security tax regressive, progressive, or proportional? What do you guys think?
Proportional.
So aggressive.
Okay, so we have two possibilities here. So let me just write this up here. Is Social Security tax regressive, proportional, or progressive? Now Nicholas says proportional because of what?
Everyone pays 7.65.
Everyone pays 7.65%, okay? That is true, right? So if I'm earning, this year, I'm going to pay 7.65% on every dollar that I earn in this job, right? Likewise, even if I get a contract, and sometimes I'll do, contract work for for a think tank or something like that, they'll ask me to write a chapter in a book, pay me $5,000 if that happens. I have to pay 7.65% on that money too. Actually, I don't pay 7.65%. I pay my regular rate, plus I pay an additional 15.3% and the additional 2.8 or whatever from Medicare, because that's why self-employment taxes are different. That's why you have to do that, is because that's why you pay such a high rate if you're self-employed, is because you have to pay your own Social Security on both the employer and the employee side. You have to take that out of both sides.
I guess if you consider caps though on Social Security, like after a certain amount, it'd be regressive.
So, for two reasons, it's actually regressive.
I finally got one right. Yes.
And one is that you're only taxed up until I think right now it's $118,500. So I have this friend who's like the smartest guy in grad school. He is my best friend in grad school. He's like the guy who got like he got the fellowship where you didn't have to work as a graduate assistant. You could just like get money for going to grad school and didn't have to do like a job or anything, because he was like, they used that to recruit him because that's how brilliant he was. Anyway, so he ended up dropping out of grad school after a couple years to go and work in the tech sector in Austin, which in the 1990s was a great place to work. Ended up working in internet banking, still works there today. But he happened to move to Atlanta at the same time I did. Like, so we both moved away at some point, and then we both ended up moving to Atlanta. We were from Austin, both moved to Atlanta at the same time. And I lived like downtown Decatur, kind of like more kind of neighborhoods in the city, and he lived way up north in one of these fancy suburbs. And so one day in early June, we went out to his house because we had kids the same age and everything else. And he's like, "Hey, do you want to drive my Porsche Boxster?" I was like, "Yeah, I want to drive your Porsche Boxster. Sounds pretty badass." He's like, "Yeah, I'm kind of celebrating today. I paid off my Social Security taxes this morning for the rest of the year." So in the first 5 months, like granted it's ratcheted up, it's been a number of years, it was more like 100,000 back then. But in the first 5 months of the year, he'd already earned $100,000, so that for the rest of the year, he was going to get a 7.65% raise because they weren't going to take Social Security taxes out of his check anymore. There's a ceiling beyond which you no longer get taxed on your Social Security, on your income for Social Security purposes. It was nice. It's a very nice car to drive. I highly recommend it. But nonetheless, that was my very smart friend with Porsche Boxster. Not me. I will be paying Social Security taxes for the rest of my life, I can tell you that much. The other reason why is that it only taxes earned income. So what other kinds of income is there?
Capital gains.
Capital gains, rental income, any kind of rent interest, anything like that. Who gets unearned income? Where on the income distribution do people get a lot of capital gains taxes and rental income and all that sort of stuff? Generally richer people, right? Poor people get most of their income through earned income, and because of that, they actually are taxed more heavily on every dollar of income that they get relative to someone who earns a lot of money through capital gains or dividends or interest or whatever else it is. So for these two reasons, it's actually regressive. The taxes are. Now, like I said before, the benefits are somewhat progressive because as my friend is earning, $200,000 a year, or back in the day when he paid up to $100,000, he got taxed onto his first $100,000. He isn't getting additional benefits proportional to his additional income, right? And for that reason, the benefit side is somewhat progressive, the tax side is somewhat regressive, and on balance, it's slightly regressive, but it's almost proportional. So when you balance out the benefit side and the tax side, it ends up being slightly regressive, but not as much as the taxes are themselves. All right. So that's the side on taxes. Any questions about that stuff? We'll talk more about tax policy when we talk about deficits and all that sort of stuff later on. Okay, so now let's talk about reform. The big problem is the trust fund is running out. Because of the baby boomers. This is a big issue for Social Security. It's also a big issue for disability. Disability, because of the spike after the 2007 to 2009 recession, actually, they're projected to run out their trust fund entirely by the end of this year. So by the end of fiscal year 17. They're supposed to be out of money entirely, which means that they have to figure out where else to get it. The thing about disability, though, it's only supposed to increase by about 0.5% per year compared to the 6% on Social Security. Part of the reason why is who is mostly drawing disability right now? What age group?
Disability?
Disability, yeah.
I would think younger people, like to 30s.
It's there proportionally. It's not that now. There has been more of an increase there, but proportionally, the people that are most likely to be kind of in this disabled category are about 45 to 65, right? So when they start getting older, they get off of disability and they go on to Social Security. And so disability is growing more slowly, partially because the aging out of the people that are on DI. Like they're aging out of the system. Social Security, you don't get the same thing, right? You either continue to draw or you die, right? So until mortality rates increase for old people, that's not going to happen. But the big issue with Social Security is huge, right? So $800 billion, $750 for just the OASI part. but you have 6% growth rate. So how do you solve? Well, there's one of two ways of doing this. One, you either reduce benefits, or, surprisingly, what's the opposite of reducing benefits? What's the other way to save money? Or to make basically make it balance?
Raise prices.
You either reduce benefits or you raise the taxes, right? One or the other. Now, lots of different proposals on this. There are ways of also completely restructuring, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the ways of raising the taxes is to eliminate the ceiling. Right? So if you're no longer capped at the total income level at which you have to pay these Social Security taxes, then that's going to be a lot more money in the system to pay for other beneficiaries, right? And the idea is that they won't make the benefits as they'll continue to make those slightly progressive, such that the additional money that they're able to draw in won't be just paid back out into the system, right? So you increase the taxes by eliminating the ceiling. You could also, what's one key way of decreasing benefits? If you were in charge of the program, what would you make happen?
You could not have people that don't need it.
Right, you can make it means tested. Right, you basically don't allow rich people to get it. Because right now, Bill Gates qualifies for Social Security, right? You know, people at the very top of the income bracket, Warren Buffett's going to qualify for Social Security, or probably already does, right? So all of those people do, but you could make it only for people that are below a certain threshold, right? That'd be one way. How about raise the retirement age? Right? To a certain extent, we've already done that, right? That's the creeping up between 65 and 67 that we've already seen was part of the reforms that took place in the 1980s, right? I'm just going to put on here COLA adjustments because this is kind of a technical thing and I don't really want to go into all the weeds of this. But basically, we calculate these cost of living adjustments incorrectly, right? Because do you guys know old people? Do you know some old people?
Yeah.
What happens when the price increases on something for an old person? Are they more responsive or less responsive to price changes than younger people?
Probably more.
They're more, right? They got all the time in the world to figure out the best deal, right? So if the price of one thing goes up, they'll spend like 2 hours figuring out, how to get a slightly better price on something because guess what? They ain't got anything better to do, right? So when we do these COLA adjustments, it's based upon average cost increases for everybody, even adjusting for some sort of like shopping around. But the shopping around doesn't take into account truly the microeconomic behavior that happens with old people where they are very responsive to price changes. So if we know what that number is, we know what the error is. It's about, on average, it's about 1/3 of a percentage point of inflation per year that we make this mistake on. Doesn't sound like very much, but when you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that are tied to 1/3 of a percentage point of increase, you multiply that over years and years and years, you're talking about serious money. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars in a very short period of time that you could save on that. By the way, the Clinton administration, there's like the Social Security administrators knew how to fix this, and they could have just fixed it with an executive order and said, oh, by the way, instead of using the CPI-U, we're going to use the CPI-U in X for the cost of living adjustments. But instead, they decided to put it in front of Congress. Guess what happened?
They expanded it.
They could have expanded it, but it went nowhere. Because what's the most powerful lobby in Washington? It's not the guns. It's not Israel. It's not, manufacturing. It's not the small business, Chamber of Commerce. It's none of those. It's the old people, right? So you never screw around with Social Security or you'll make the old people mad, and that just went nowhere. let's see, what else could you do? You could, oh yeah, by the way, this retirement age, this was largely set when the life expectancy in the United States was 65, right? So we created a program which said basically on average, you'll be dead by the time you get the benefits, and then now people live 15 years longer, and we didn't change the retirement age. So that's part of the reason why this is so expensive. Another thing is that we do neither of these specific things, but what we could do is make it fully funded and invest in the stock market. Who proposed that? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Nicholas.
I don't know. I'm a fan of making people invest in the stock market and doing away with Social Security.
I mean, a lot of countries have done this. Like Chile has tried this. Like I think it's like 7 or 8 Latin American countries have gone through some sort of pension reform where they've gone from a pay-as-you-go system to a fully funded system. As long as it's not the government deciding which companies are invested in, if it's individual retirement accounts, something like that, this seems to make the most sense. But what's the main problem here is the transition, right? So if you're currently a beneficiary, you still need people to pay you now, and then those people that are younger have to also be investing in the stock market to start building up their nest egg. And it's just a transition issue, right? Basically what you have to do is you have to go and have higher Social Security taxes for about 30 years in order to fully fund a system. And it sounds like, oh, well, great, it's not really going to take effect for 30 years. But had we tried this in the 80s, guess what? We would be fully funded by now, right? So kicking the can down the road just doesn't solve the problem. And unfortunately, that's what politicians always have the incentive to do, is not really fix the problem. Like I said, Social Security is the third rail of American politics. You touch and you die. But something needs to be done if we're not going to run into some serious problems and actually have to increase taxes, make it means tested or something like that. Bush, George W. had an idea of trying to invest some of it in the stock market, and the AARP, the old people lobby, went crazy. And it became a big political issue, and so he backed away from it. But it probably was the best proposal that he had in terms of like actually fundamentally, in a positive way, changing the federal budget and everything else. So, all right, that's all I've got. We're going to talk about world poverty, I think, next time. So I'll post the quiz on Friday. That'll be due on Monday. So we'll get back to that schedule as of this week.
What I always thought was weird was like, if you're on Social Security, you get $1,200 a month, but like, say you have to go to a retirement home, they'll start giving that retirement home $6,000 a month to take care of you. And they used to pay a family member like an extra living stipend to help take care of you. It would be like $900 or $1,000 a month, and they did away with it because they said it was wasteful.